We're pleased to welcome back to set Leslie Cutler, who's a licensed mental health counselor. Welcome back, Leslie.
Thank you, Julie. It's wonderful to be here.
We love having you for your section, which we call Mindful Moments.
That's correct.
Okay. Today we're going to talk about something that's really quite prevalent in our society, and it's dealing with kids, talking to kids about tough subjects. Yes. Now, as we know, everything that's going on in the world, aside from the hurricanes that just happened, causes stress and strife for children.
Yes. And you know, I think our children are touched by trauma every day, no matter how much we try to protect them from that.
Yep.
And we as parents do a pretty good job of doing that. But there's no way that children are not hearing about this. You know, I mean, again and again, we see that children just have no idea of what's going on, or they get little pieces of it and become very, very fearful, and it's a huge cause of anxiety for them.
Right.
So today I wanted to talk about, 5 different ways, just offering tips of how to talk to our children about some of these really difficult topics that are happening in our world today.
And it's not just little ones. I mean, this even extends to our children that are in college.
Yes, exactly.
Because I know that my children even have concern, and they're in their 20s.
Right. Right. And my children that are very, very young are coming to me asking questions. So.
Okay, so let's talk about the 5 different tips for helping. So the first thing is for the parent to initiate the conversation.
Exactly. And just because kids aren't talking about it doesn't mean that they're not aware of it. Right. And that's what we were saying. You know, a lot of times they might sense our own discomfort and be fearful of coming to us for fear that we might not want to take on another thing, or perhaps they're afraid of what some of the feelings that they have are, and they're afraid to even voice that. But what happens is, and adults do this as well as children, is that they speculate what might be going on, and they fill in these pieces of information with a lot of times information that isn't true. And often they've created a scenario or a situation that's actually worse than the reality of what's happened. And it's interesting because the American Psychological Association says that children as young as 4 and 5 years old are able to have these conversations. And in fact, these conversations are very, very good for them. And one way to kind of initiate the conversation is to perhaps ask a question like this. You know, what are you and your friends talking about XYZ? Or what are some of your own thoughts around that?
Right.
And at least that opens the door to having this conversation. And this is where the second piece comes in very helpful. So number 2, find out what they know by listening. So we can, by carefully listening to them, understand what they know, and to sit in silence and just listen. And it's very, very hard to do that sometimes, especially when what they're saying to us might seem a little bit crazy.
Right.
For example, if you have a 4 or 5-year-old saying to you, well, I'm afraid with every plane that I see going through the sky that it's carrying a bomb, instead of jumping in and saying, oh, that's ridiculous. No, no, no. You need to stop right there and say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but this is the reality. Letting them know that nothing is too silly to discuss and nothing is too outrageous, and that you indeed can handle it. It's interesting, though, because sometimes they might ask questions that we don't know how to answer.
For example?
Well, you know, they might say, well, what do you think is going to happen in terms of North Korea?
Okay.
And, well, my goodness, none of us really know the answer to that. And this is where you can be very honest and say, listen, I am not sure. This is a very, very tricky question.
Right.
But please know that there are very competent people working together to help find answers to this difficult problem. And I will keep you posted as to what's going on, and we can read about this together. Or sometimes we might not know the answer, but the answer is out there. And this might be a very important time to, perhaps with our older children, go through the process of investigating what the answer might be.
Right.
And this shows the child that the world is not completely without order, that there is some sequence of events of what happens, and they can understand what indeed is going on.
Is it important, though, for you to direct your children, no matter what their age is, to appropriate places to find adequate information? Because as you know, if you Google something, and that's what kids do, you can get anything.
You can get anything.
So how do you as a parent vet through all the different places you can get information on subjects and steer them in the right direction?
So that's where I think you need to do a little bit of your own footwork. Maybe in advance you Google some things yourself and see, what might be appropriate for the child instead of just putting them in front of CNN.
Right.
We don't want to expose them to the media because that will give them an incredible amount of anxiety. They're watching, planes flying
Right.
into buildings, or
Right.
I mean, it's just too much for most kids to be able to handle. But if we can kind of do a little footwork on our own, maybe pull up some articles or print out some information
Right.
that is age appropriate, then we can sit down with them and help find some of the answers.
So this is why it's really important too, is as much as we can as parents to monitor what they're hearing and what they're watching all
Right.
the time.
All the time.
Because you can't help what they're picking up at school, what their friends are saying.
Yep, what
But-
they hear on the bus.
Right, but
we have no
when they're
say.
at home, you need to monitor that.
Right.
Tailor your answers to your child's age. Now this is tough.
This is very, very tough. And every child is different.
Yes.
And so we need to take into account that particular piece. But one thing that is said again and again in my field is don't keep your answers so vague that they give the child nothing to go on.
Right.
In other words, by saying something like, something really bad happened in a faraway place and lots of people were hurt, does not help a child, because then they're thinking, well, how is that different from the things that happen in this area where people are hurt, and why is this given so much attention? So it becomes very, very confusing in that way. But we might say a 5 or 6 year old, well, there was there was a hurricane, and it was in Florida, which is hundreds of miles away from here. It's not planning on coming up the coast, so we should be safe. But please know that there were some people that were affected by this storm, and things are being done to take care of them, or something.
Yeah,
along
and
those
even how
lines.
maybe they can help that effort by having a lemonade stand or
Right.
putting their allowance towards a donation or something like that where they feel empowered.
Yes, and I'm going to get to that shortly, but I
Okay,
think that
sorry.
that's really, really important
Yeah.
because kids do feel powerless at times like this, especially when they know that there are other kids their age out there that are experiencing this, and they feel like there's nothing that they can do. So
Absolutely.
we'll talk about that in a second. But when you're talking to grade school children or teens, you can be a little bit more specific. So in fact, my son came to me the other day, he's 10, and he had all kinds of questions about hurricanes. Well, do we get them here? What do they mean?
Yep.
How far away exactly are these parts of Florida? So we were able to sit down and look at, a map. Well, here we are, and
Yep.
here they are, and this is X number of miles, and these are the towns that were affected, and this is how hurricanes form, and this is what, and so it became more of kind of a learning experience for him. But I could be very specific with him, whereas to my daughter who's 6,
Not as much.
not as
Right,
much. That
right.
wouldn't mean anything
A
to
lot
her.
of wind, a lot of rain. They
Right.
form over the ocean, and there's nothing we can do.
Yeah,
Right.
and we keep it simple at that. But
Right.
it's interesting because I think back to that quote that Mr. Rogers said, and I think we've all heard it before. I remember he said that he went to his mother during a time of crisis and said, this is all very, very overwhelming. And his mother said to him, please be sure you look for the helpers. There are always helpers in any situation like this.
Yeah.
And he talked about that a lot on his show, but by finding the helpers, it kind of renews our sense of faith and hope in
Yep.
the world, that there are always those people out there that are compassionate,
That's
the
right.
ones that go in that are willing to sacrifice all, which is, something that we can mention to a child at any age.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And number 4 is encourage children to share their feelings. Again, this is a bit of what we've been talking
Yeah,
about,
yep.
but kind of keeping those lines of communication open. If indeed a child is struggling and having difficulty languaging what it is that they might be feeling, this is where we can kind of incorporate some nonverbal techniques for managing these feelings, such as doing art or dance or singing or some other way for them to use some form of self-expression around
Excellent.
this.
Okay, that's excellent advice. Encourage children to act.
Yes.
And my mom always told me, act, don't react.
I love that. And I
Okay.
think that that's perfect for all of us to take with us. But I do believe that compassion is a wonderful motivator. And this is the time where we can show our kids what it's like to give back as well. And some ideas around this might be, writing letters to victims and their families, maybe sending thank you notes to first responders, perhaps getting a community group together as
Yeah.
a way of educating about a specific issue, or writing a letter to an editor, or as you've mentioned before, doing a lemonade stand or
Right.
some sort of donation
Yep.
type bank in order to, give back in some way.
Excellent. These are great points. And,
Thank you.
and the conversations with our children continue when they're young, when they're older, even when they're
Yes.
like I have conversations with my dad all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it never stops, and it's good to always have that open sense of communication where you can tell your parent anything, you can talk about anything, and that's such a freeing thing I think for kids.
Absolutely, it is. And kids are resilient, but we need to keep communicating.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
This was
Julie,
great.
it was wonderful to be here
Went
today.
quick,
Yes.
as always.
Thank you.